Hello, everyone. Welcome to the English AP Lit review session today. We're finishing up this week just looking at some different elements of literature, ways to dive into a text. I'm Susan Barber from Grady High School in Atlanta, Georgia. Here's my co-teacher, Bear Barber. He is with us today. And if you are in my class, you'll notice this chain, um, this construction paper chain behind you. We're coming back from spring break today. We count down the days till the end of the school year. Crazy, I know, by removing a link every day. And since y'all are in my class now, I'll get to count down with y'all. So we are 1 month out from the AP Lit exam today. And Mr. Escobar and I are excited to help you. Couple of shout outs before he gets to you. Miss Larish class in Vancouver, British Columbia. Hello to you. Broomfield High School AP Lit students from Colorado are watching, and Miss Green's class from Venice High School. So many emails. Thank you. We're getting through and responding as quickly as we can, but love all of y'all and excited to share this time and space with you. Mr. Escobar, tell me something good.
How are you doing this morning? We had a good weekend. We had a good weekend with the kids, trying to keep uh, informed but not obsessed with the news, as I think is everyone's objective lately. But definitely excited to be back here with you today and with everyone who's watching and who will watch us later on as we delve into these literary skills that we're going to be talking about this week. And just a heads up that towards the end of this week and for all of next week, we're going to be focusing specifically on writing. So we're going to wrap up with some of the literary elements now. Then we're going to be looking at more sample essays and sample writing, and really targeting that skill, because we are nearing the exam, are we not? Before we know it,
We
we're going to be doing it.
Yes, it is exam time. My students are doing a timed writing today, and we're just going to see where we are and what we need to do. So, it seems like so long ago from last week's homework. If you were in my class, I would pass out pickles to you. We would all eat a pickle. There's a great a clip from Friends, the TV show, that goes perfectly with this. So we would sit around and eat pickles and look at the Peregrine pickle prompt today. But so you'll just have to go to your refrigerator and grab a pickle while we do this. But we were focusing on contrast, and we asked you to identify some contrast in this passage. And there are all kind of contrast, and we're even going to continue this conversation about contrast today. But again, lots of different ways you could go with this. Some contrasts that we noticed that seemed obvious were we have these two contrasting characters. We have a lover and a brother, and they both have different interest in the girl. One of them is protecting her reputation, but the other is defending their love. And then we have this contrast of a soldier and a youth, and even a contrast of a gentleman and the appearances that carries with it. And then maybe a subpar horse and carriage, and that doesn't fit like this gentlemanly um, appearance that they should go after. So those are just a few of the ones that stood out to us. We will look at this prompt a little later today and dive more deeply into it. But again, it's not, and you may have gotten different contrast, and there are tons of other different contrast in
Right,
here.
and we purposely didn't mark any of the ones in the second paragraph. It's not to say that there aren't any, right? It's just we're not doing all the work for you. We keep repeating that.
Correct. And again, the other thing we keep repeating is identification and finding these. That's just the first step. The most important thing is, what do these contrasts mean? How do these contrasts allow us to make meaning of the text, to dive deeper into it? Why are they here? So when we look at the lover and the brother, we see that, part of the function or the why, maybe the titles embodied and pronounced by the two men are vital to understanding their behavior. They have different motives. Remember, we're wanting to dive into why are they doing this? What is their agency? Because that tells us about values in the society. So are they genuinely, where they're genuinely um, internally espouse their respective roles. Their outward behavior is dictated by how a lover and a brother ought to behave. And then that sets us up nicely to think about the social commentary in this passage. So, again, that's just one way of explaining the function. Now, today we are going to be diving into contrasting characters. And anytime, not anytime, a lot of times when you have prompts and you have a couple of characters, you're going to see the contrast in them. It really sets you up not to notice just about character A or character B, but you can learn about character B through what you see in character A and vice versa. So we're going to look at contrasting characters. Protagonist, we already know what a protagonist is. It's the main character in the narrative, and the antagonist will oppose the protagonist. Now, what we learn from this relationship of the protagonist and the antagonist is we can see there are conflicts, and the conflicts really hit at central ideas and interpretations in the text. So today we're going to specifically look at the protagonist and the antagonist and what contrasting values they represent. And this shows us these values, beliefs, assumptions, biases, all of these are going to really be an avenue into a controlling or central idea in a text. So here we go.
Here we go. And the first look here will be a rather simple one. We're looking at stories where the protagonist and antagonist are easily identifiable. So the first one here would be Hamlet. We know that the character of Hamlet is in stark opposition to Claudius, correct? And there are others, of course. You know, he argues with many people in the play, but these are the two opposing forces. We have Othello and we have Iago, the ultimate bad guy, in opposition to the hero of this Shakespearean tragedy. I used an example from A Thousand Splendid Suns. We had already spoken about the Kite Runner. So here's a shout out to those of you who teach A Thousand Splendid Suns, an absolutely beautiful novel. And in this one, we have the character of Miriam, and she is in stark opposition to Rashid. And there are other sets as well, right? The more complex the novel, the more antagonists, for example, that might be at play in opposition to the main character. The bottom left comes from a novel titled Jasmine by Mukherjee. And Jasmine also potentially has many antagonists, and certainly it does actually, but Sukhwinder is definitely one of them. This man opposes her, and his actions drastically and dramatically and tragically impact her life. In The Color Purple, we have Celie and Mister. We could have said Celie and her father, but certainly Celie and Mister are opposing forces here that are in constant friction or struggle with one another. And in The Road, we have Papa, we have the boy, and we have the blood coats. And these are fairly simple in terms of we I don't think many people out there are going to argue with these. You might expand your definition of the protagonist in these texts or expand your definition of the antagonist, but I think everyone can see that these two are really, as the picture shows, they're fighting, you know, they're pulling and pushing in opposite forces, directions. However, reading a passage and identifying these opposing forces, which right now we're going to label protagonist and antagonist, can sometimes be complicated. And notice that Ms. Barber said when she talked about the objective, she talked about the the force that is in opposition to the protagonist. She didn't say the character, because it's not always a character. Sometimes it's an outside entity, and we're going to look at some examples of that. So here's a bit more complex, some examples that are more complex. In The Awakening, which is a very popular novella, I know a lot of you out there have read it. I know a lot of you out there have taught it. I think that it's simple for us to arrive at Edna Pontellier being the protagonist. But what exactly is the antagonist? What is the opposing force? You might say it's Leon's. You might say it's perhaps Madame Ratignolle. Um, Edna at times thinks it's the children, maybe, but society, I think, is what Miss Barber and I landed on with this one. And again, it's more complex. It's more ambiguous. It's not a simple good versus evil in this novel. So we're satisfied with saying that it's society. In The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we have um, certainly Dr. Jekyll on one side, but what's on the other side? Well, if you say that it's Mr. Hyde, they're the same person, they're the same body. So that's a strange understanding, I think, of this duality, which we're talking about, because how can you be your own opposition? Well, you can be, and that's one of the things that makes this short novel so complex, right? And the one that really got to us, we started thinking about Waiting for Godot. Vladimir and Estragon are clearly the protagonists of this drama, right? They're front and center. They're the two constant characters in this work. But what is the antagonist? Honestly, we couldn't come up with the perfect opposing force in this drama. Is it Vladimir and Estragon themselves? Do their decisions, do their actions serve as the block, the obstacle that prevents them from moving forward? Is it Pozzo? Is it time itself as a construct? Is it death? Is it Godot? Is it the theory of absurdism or existentialism? However you envision it, it is in the function, it is in the discussion. When you say Vladimir and Estragon seek X, but they're unable to attain it because of Y. When you delve into the Y, when you delve into that variable, that's when you're talking about that opposing force, and it need not be a character. So here are three examples that are a little more complicated, or perhaps a lot more complicated than the ones we saw before.
And I was even thinking about The Street. We looked at Ludi Johnson and we saw really the wind was the acting force against her. So, in a way, the wind became the antagonist, or the setting was working against her. So, we just want you to lean into these contrasts, because once we can start unpacking contrast, that's where we can get into the complexity of what's happening.
And if you take setting, for example, remember that it's not just the place, right? We have the wind, we have the mean streets of this urban environment, but at the same time, what's the time period, right? Are there racial divides at play? Are there socioeconomic divides at play that are also presenting obstacles for Ms. Johnson? So the deeper you delve into this antagonistic force, then the greater complexity you'll be able to provide in your essay. We need to be able to consider certain questions. So let's say you take the street, you take Miss Johnson, and we readily recognize her as the protagonist, right? That she's the main acting force here. But what's the purpose of thinking about protagonists and antagonists, or what's the purpose of thinking about contrasting characters? Because it's not always a protagonist and the antagonist, right? We can have, for example, um, in a certain passage, in a specific scene, your best friend could be the opposing force, even though your best friend isn't the antagonist for the novel as a whole. So, what are the questions that we should ask ourselves? Number one, what do we learn about the protagonist by the presence of the antagonist? I always talk to my students about how the creation of a character just complicates things so much for a writer, right? Why would you give birth to another creature whose story you need to tell, whose, you need to make this person move, you need to make this person talk, you need to make this person live or die and have their own world. It's just so much trouble. It's a hassle really to give birth to a new character. So if a writer has given us someone, we need to understand their purpose within the work. And Ms. Barber told you earlier, we're not just going to learn about the protagonist by examining that characterization, but you are going to juxtapose that figure to all those that stand alongside them. So, what do we learn about Hamlet because Claudius exists? And maybe by thinking about the opposite, you might arrive at something. You know, if Claudius did not exist, what would we not learn about Hamlet? And perhaps what would Hamlet not have learned about himself at that point? Number two, what clashing perspectives are held by the protagonist and antagonist? And if we stick to Hamlet and Claudius, these perspectives might deal with politics, government, the body politic and the body personal, right? What perspectives about life, about family, about love, about fidelity, about betrayal, about tradition, uh, do we do we now have to inspect because these two figures have clashed? And ultimately, what values are highlighted by the interaction between these two figures? What do we learn about what is important in Denmark because Hamlet and Claudius have this feud? If you ground your analysis of contrasting characters on these three questions, I think you're certainly going to arrive at claims that you can make, at interpretations that you can make regarding the text. Anything you want to add about these questions, Ms. Barber? I see you shaking, nodding your head.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. That's so good because again, the characters, they are our way in to these controlling ideas and central ideas. And once we see like what the characters stand for and are fighting for, and that's often brought out in this contrast, then we're able to see what the work is really about, why it was written. We're always getting to the why.
And when you went over the homework today, we saw that in the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, a lot of the contrasts in that first paragraph were about the two characters. If we remind our audience, last time on Friday when we discussed contrast, we talked about contrasting images and tone and settings. And here we don't get a lot of that. The contrasts are based on um, Mr. Pickle and Mr. Godfrey. So if we focus on these two and we return to your homework here, and we think of these two gentlemen and we apply the questions, then the questions become a little more specific. What do we learn about Peregrine Pickle by the presence of Godfrey Gauntlet? So if Gauntlet had not approached Pickle and questioned him, then what would we lose about this character, right? Does Pickle show himself to be someone who will stand up to a challenge? Is he someone who will fight for the love of his life? We perhaps wouldn't know the answers to that if Gauntlet had not put him through the gauntlet, right? This is sort of like the obvious pun there. What clashing perspectives are held by Peregrine Pickle and Godfrey Gauntlet? I would go back to what you had talked about here, which is one is the brother and one is the lover. And these are the perspectives from which they each meander the world, right? They will act, they will speak as the brother and as the lover of this young lady. And they each believe that there are certain strict societal expectations that are held because of those roles that they have adopted. So, what do we learn about their perspective, their worldview, because they are brother and lover? And imagine if one were president and father or neighbor or son, the perspective would be different, right? So the role here is really what defines their worldview and their actions. And what are ultimately the values highlighted in the work as a whole, or in the passage as a whole, right? Because it's just an excerpt, because of the interactions of these two figures. And here we're talking about certain societal values, right? uh, Propriety, meeting expectations, your reputation, what other people think about you, um, eh, willing to risk your life if you are uh, challenged, or else other people might think you're weak. And if you're weak with this verbal confrontation, then you might be weak in other realms, and then that'll affect you socially. And ultimately, I mean, the passage is hilarious, right? So hopefully students are able to get into the fact that neither of these gentlemen really want to fight, but
Mhm.
they're acting because they feel that they have to fight. And that's what comes through when they're pitted against each other in this short passage.
Mhm.
And ultimately, as you answer these questions, we get to function. And, a way of thinking about this is, let's move away from the characters at the end. Let's move away from the characters. And if we go back to the prompt, look at that first dependent clause in the passage below, from The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle by Tobias Millet. I would focus on the writer at that point, right? So we have these two characters. Now let's go to the writer. Why did the writer
Mhm.
create them? Why did the writer birth them into this novel? When we answer that question, we're definitely hitting on function at that point.
Right. The characters really just become the writer's tools to get his message across that he wants to deliver. So
Absolutely.
good. So good. Um, debrief and summary. We talked about contrasting characters. So we want to be able to first identify, how do these characters, what do we see in one character that we don't see in another? How do they contrast each other? And then, more importantly, after we've identified that, is how did these contrast, what did they tell us about about each character, and what each character values? Once we are able to determine these opposing values, opposing things, that differing things that each character values, then we're going to be able to see conflict, and what's really being unpacked by the writer. And we'll be able to have a way into the controlling idea, or the central idea, or the bigger picture of this text, why it was being written. So the characters, the contrasting characters, again, it's a way into the text for you to make meaning from it. All of these different things that we've been talking about, these different elements, they are just ways for you to dive into that text, to crawl around in the text, and be able to think on it, and think what they mean and why it's important. And then for you to have an interpretation of these texts. They're tools for you to get in, dig around, and make meaning of the text.
Miss Barber, as I hear you say this, it makes perfect sense to me. But if I'm going to play the role of the student for a second, some of my students will get stuck in that first bullet, and they're going to read the passage and say, oh, I know exactly what I want to say about this character, but nothing's coming out. And because I think that's
Mhm.
the situation that many writers face, right? Like I understand it in my brain, but somehow my pencil isn't able to sketch what it is that I'm thinking. I don't have the right words for it. We should remind our audience that many videos ago, we had a conversation about a chart with adjectives for characters. And there was social, mental, physical descriptions, right? Just full of adjectives. And I think those adjectives will help us answer that first bullet, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, if even if you can just, because we're doing all of this reading and thinking quickly and in real time. So if you can just, character A is this trait, character B is this trait. And it's not, that there's one trait to identify them, but once you can start assigning that and then finding the evidence of that back in the text, then that helps you frame up your thinking and your claims, and then you're able to see the contrast in them.
Yeah.
So tonight, we're going to go back and look at this prompt. We looked at it maybe the first week. All of the weeks are kind of running together now. But Rosamond and Lydgate, and they're this newly married couple, and they are experiencing some conflict over finances. And so we want you to look at this prompt and think about the contrasting characters. And we have a series of questions for you to answer tonight. And they are, when we look at this prompt, what do we learn about the protagonist in the presence of the antagonist? Well, this is an interesting question. Um, who is the protagonist? Who is the antagonist? I mean, that's going to be really, that's an interesting question in itself. But
But so
how
many times you've reminded us that the label doesn't matter, right? It's the
exactly.
analysis that really gets to the heart of the issue. So whether you say it's Rosamond or Lydgate, I mean, you could place them either which way in that question, right?
It all depends on how you view the text and what you want to argue within the text. Each of these texts becomes like a living work in your hands because you're reading it with fresh eyes. So you can argue it either way as long as you point to the text and defend yourself. And that's what y'all are all set up to do. So, what do we learn about each of these two characters? And then the clashing perspectives that they have. And this prompt is so great to look at the different things that each of these characters value. It's really easy to see. So you're going to have fun digging into that. And then what values are highlighted by their interactions, and what does all of this mean? Why is all of this important? So we want you to think about those questions, jot some ideas down about those questions tonight, and we will open there tomorrow.
Yeah,
Go
and
ahead.
I just want to clarify between the second and third question. Maybe for the second one, it'll be easier for students to understand that that's where they're looking at the characters. And in
Hmm.
the third question, they're looking at the society, right?
Yep.
So the characters in question two each hold a perspective. And when these two perspectives clash, the author is commenting on something about society as a whole. And that might clarify, I think, our thinking for students out there.
And again, these are just, it's not like you will have all of these questions and you'll be checking them off. These are just ways for you to think about, how can I approach a text? What do I see using these questions as tools to get in there and dig around and make meaning of it?
Because you
So,
will be writing the essay, right?
yes,
So that's
that
just the
is
first step.
right. So we this is what you're going to be looking at tonight. Do we want them to write a full essay tonight?
Oh, we're done being Mr. Nice Guy and Mrs. Nice Guy here. We're done with that.
Do what your teacher tells you to
There you
do
go.
with this. But I will say, the more you practice, I mean, it's a skill. The more you practice, the better you become. The more
Well,
you
and
practice.
actually, something else, Miss Barber, something that I'm dealing with my own students. I have writing portfolios, but they're at school,
Mm-hmm.
right? So my students don't have their drafts at home.
Mm-hmm.
So our audience may want to start writing some of these essays because as you and I get into the writing lessons, they're going to want to see some of their own essays so they can track to see if they're doing the things that we're telling them should be done, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's just good practice to Write as many as you can before the AP exam.
Right. You'll know that balance of not absolutely burning yourself out, but pushing yourself to grow further. And you know what? There are a lot of times that I sit down and I write these essays with my students, and then I let my students score me. That's slightly terrifying. So, but I like to practice too, because I need the practice as well. So that's what we want you to look at tonight. If you know someone who doesn't have access or needs a device, reach out to College Board, let them know they are working on getting all students access so they can take the test. Mr. Escobar, do you have anything else to say?
That's it. I look forward to tomorrow's lesson, and I look forward to spending the rest of the week with all of you.
Bear is still with us, so he says, have a great Monday. I'll take a chain off for tomorrow. Enjoyed it. Y'all have a great day.